I had been on the Hill long enough to know when someone was picking a fight, and when someone was trying to erase you altogether. But this time, it wasn't a fringe senator or a cable news personality throwing cheap jabs on air. It came from the Chief Justice himself. The hearing was packed. Cameras lined the back wall. I sat with my notes, calm but ready. The Judiciary Committee had called me, Representative Jasmine Crockett, to testify about judicial transparency and ethical accountability, topics that had been heating up across the country. John Roberts sat at the head of the panel like a monarch on a marble throne. He hadn't said much at first, just silent, tight-lipped glares. Until I finished my third point, referencing certain undisclosed financial dealings tied to unnamed justices. That's when he leaned forward, adjusted his glasses, and with a tone so cold it could freeze a furnace, said, "If you hate this country's institutions so much, maybe you should consider leaving it." The room stopped breathing. I saw a few jaws drop, aides, interns, even a couple of senators. No one could believe what they'd just heard. My heart thudded once. Then, silence. I slowly placed my pen down, looked directly at him, and replied, "With all due respect, Chief Justice, I didn't take an oath to protect your comfort. I took an oath to protect the Constitution. Maybe you should reread it before suggesting who belongs in this country." The room erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Half the room rose to their feet. A murmur broke into a roar. And Judge Roberts, suddenly, wasn't the one holding the gavel anymore. Within seconds, the moment was all over social media. Clips of my clapback to Chief Justice Roberts were trending on every major platform. News anchors were scrambling to reframe their segments. The word "unprecedented" was tossed around like candy, but honestly, it didn't even begin to describe what had just happened. I could still feel the heat in my chest as the echoes of gasps and whispers circled the committee room. Senator Whitehouse leaned toward me and whispered, "That might be the most courageous thing I've ever seen in this chamber." But I wasn't after applause. I was after truth. Roberts leaned back, visibly rattled. He looked at the other justices sitting beside him, hoping for backup. Justice Alito shifted uncomfortably. Justice Kagan lowered her eyes. No one spoke. The chair of the committee cleared his throat awkwardly. Let's all remember to maintain decorum," he muttered. I turned to him, voice steady. Decorum doesn't mean silence in the face of disrespect. And it doesn't protect institutions from accountability. There it was again, that pause. That charged silence, thick with implications. I saw a black congressional aide in the corner nodding fiercely, barely able to contain her emotion. And somewhere near the back, a conservative pundit stared at me like he'd just watched his entire argument collapse in slow motion. Later that night, I received a message that stunned me even more. It wasn't from a supporter or journalist. It was from someone inside the Supreme Court itself. The message was brief: "Representative Crockett, if you keep going, you're going to uncover more than anyone's ready for. Be careful. And don't stop." The message haunted me all night. I read it over and over, trying to dissect the intent behind every word. Was it a warning? A threat? Or an invitation? By morning, it was clear something had shifted. Reporters camped outside my office. Constituents flooded my inbox with support. But behind all the noise, something more disturbing began to emerge, a pattern. Whistleblowers. Leaked memos. Sealed court records that suddenly weren't so sealed anymore. I scheduled a private meeting with Representative Jamie Raskin and Representative Katie Porter. Both were veterans in cutting through bureaucratic fog. When I showed them the message, Raskin's brow furrowed deeply. "Someone inside is trying to tell you they've seen things," he said quietly. "Things the public was never supposed to know." Porter added, "And if Roberts snapped like that, you hit a nerve. Maybe even the nerve." That same day, an anonymous email dropped into my encrypted inbox. Attached, a scanned memo marked confidential, internal use only. It was dated 3 years ago, and signed by someone from the Chief Justice's administrative staff. The memo outlined a meeting, off record, where certain justices allegedly discussed media containment strategies should controversial financial ties or outside communications ever come to light. I was stunned. This wasn't just about ethics violations. This was coordinated shielding. That evening, I held a press conference. The American people have a right to a judiciary that serves justice, not private interests. Today I received information that points to systematic efforts to conceal critical conflicts at the highest levels of our courts. I will not be intimidated into silence. Flashes burst from cameras. Reporters shouted questions. The Capitol buzzed like a hive just kicked open. Meanwhile, inside the marble halls of the Supreme Court, a different kind of silence was growing. Chief Justice Roberts hadn't said a word publicly since the hearing. But behind closed doors, he was drafting a letter. A letter addressed to me. 3 days after my press conference, the envelope arrived. No return address. No formal seal. Just my name, typed in small black letters. Inside was a single-page letter, unsigned, but there was no doubt who had written it. The phrasing, the tone, the veiled arrogance dressed as civility, it had John Roberts written all over it. Congresswoman Crockett, you have entered territory that, for the good of our nation's institutions, should not be further disturbed. The judiciary is not immune to criticism, but public destabilization only serves our enemies. I trust you'll understand the importance of restraint. It wasn't a threat, exactly. It was worse, it was an attempt to remind me of my place. To make me doubt my path. To suggest that the silence of the powerful was not cowardice, but control. I held the letter in my hand for a long time before slipping it into a folder marked Documents for Oversight. I wasn't backing down. Not now. Later that evening, I went on the Rachel Maddow show. The interview was already trending before it aired. Congresswoman, Rachel asked carefully, you stood your ground against the most powerful judge in the nation, and now you're releasing sealed memos. Aren't you afraid? I looked into the camera and said, I'm more afraid of what happens when people don't stand up. By the time the interview ended, 3 more leaks had hit my office inbox, this time from federal clerks. What they described painted an even darker picture, justices quietly influencing legal research outcomes, outside consultants being paid through law school endowments, and worst of all, internal discussions about targeting select congressional voices who endanger judicial independence. My name was listed. Highlighted. It was official, I wasn't just a critic anymore. I was now their threat. By the following morning, it was clear the letter had backfired. Leaked to the press. No. I didn't have to. Someone else had already done it. The unsigned letter, the one clearly written by Roberts, was now the centerpiece of a Washington Post exposé titled, A Message of Silence, Chief Justice's Warning to Representative Crockett Raises New Alarms. Cable news couldn't stop talking about it. Panelists were split. Some called me reckless. Others called me a patriot. But no matter the label, one thing had become undeniable, the court wasn't untouchable anymore. That afternoon, I met privately with a handful of colleagues in the Capitol basement, a secure room usually reserved for defense briefings. We reviewed the evidence. Not just leaks, but patterns, judicial decisions benefiting donors, sealed case assignments redirected without transparency, and files mysteriously disappearing after media requests. Representative Porter, ever analytical, laid it out in bullet points: financial entanglements, improper communications with lobbyists, suppression of congressional oversight. This isn't just unethical, she said. It borders on criminal. We agreed to form a special bipartisan inquiry, quietly, at first. It had to be airtight. No leaks, no speculation. Just truth. But by that evening, I received another message. This time, not a letter. It was a voicemail from an unknown number, disguised through layers of masking software. The voice was modulated, but steady. Stop digging, Congresswoman. If you don't, the next leak will be about you. I froze. This wasn't politics anymore. This was war. And they'd just made it personal. I replayed the voicemail 5 times. The distortion made it impossible to trace the voice, but the intent was crystal clear. Whoever they were, they had access, confidence, and the audacity to think a threat would shut me down. It had the opposite effect. I called my chief of staff and security liaison to my apartment. We swept the place for bugs. Clean. Then I called in a favor from someone I trusted, a former intelligence officer now consulting with members of Congress. Within hours, he confirmed, the call had bounced through encrypted proxies in Virginia, D.C., and an internal server registered to a federal agency. The same agency that occasionally coordinated with the Supreme Court Security Division. That's when it hit me, this wasn't just rogue actors protecting their legacies. There was a network. And I had just tripped the wire. The next day, I walked into a closed-door hearing with the Oversight Committee and dropped everything we had, timelines, documents, sworn statements from clerks, and I played the voicemail aloud. Dead silence. Then Representative Jamie Raskin, who had stayed quiet throughout, leaned forward and said, "We need a special prosecutor." That was the moment it became real. Not just for me, but for them. The old guard. The ones who built their walls so high, they thought no one could scale them. But I wasn't climbing over their walls. I was tearing them down. By nightfall, the Department of Justice received the formal recommendation for a special prosecutor. Chief Justice Roberts, once the untouchable architect of institutional authority, was now named in the inquiry. And as I stood on the Capitol steps, reporters shouting from every direction, I spoke the words I'd waited my whole life to say: justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins with the courage to confront what others are too afraid to name. The crowd behind the barricades erupted. But inside the Supreme Court, lights burned late into the night. And for the first time in decades, they were afraid. The investigation hadn't even begun, but cracks were already forming inside the High Court. 2 junior clerks resigned overnight. A long-time administrative staffer, who had once been seen as Chief Justice Roberts' right hand, suddenly went on indefinite leave. And a source inside the DOJ confirmed that sealed communications were now being subpoenaed, including encrypted personal emails from 2 justices. Washington was holding its breath. Meanwhile, I received a call from someone I didn't expect, Justice Sonia Sotomayor. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. They never expected anyone to push back this hard, she told me quietly. Keep going. Just know, some of us are watching. And not all of us are afraid of the truth. That call meant more than she could know. Because even though I'd stood my ground on the outside, internally, I was exhausted. Threats. Smears. And now coordinated attempts to paint me as radical and reckless, a desperate PR campaign clearly orchestrated by the very people who once sat above accountability. But I refused to be baited. I stayed focused. Our bipartisan inquiry team grew. Moderate Republicans, though cautious, started to ask questions behind closed doors. Some of them even thanked me privately. "You're saying what we've whispered about for years," one senior GOP rep told me. "We just didn't want to lose our careers." My answer was simple: then you don't deserve them. That week, I released Memo 2 to the public. It detailed a hidden investment portfolio tied to the family of a sitting justice, one who had ruled in favor of multiple corporations he'd quietly benefited from. The fallout was instant. News anchors dropped their scripts. Protesters gathered outside the court. Ethics groups filed formal demands for recusals. And still, silence from Roberts. But it wouldn't last. Because the next document was already printing in my office, one that would force him to speak. One he never thought would see daylight. It was labeled Internal Strategy Memo, CJ Review Only. No signature. No headers. Just a timestamp from 18 months prior and the most damning contents I'd read yet. It detailed a private meeting, not with other justices, but with two major political donors, a retired energy executive, and a media consultant. The purpose? To plan narrative control in the event of judicial scrutiny by progressive House members. My name was mentioned. Twice. It outlined ways to delegitimize critics in the media, fund counternarratives through academic think pieces, and, most disturbingly, use unofficial channels within certain intelligence offices to monitor public officials viewed as judicial threats. I stared at the last line for a long time, ensure containment. If necessary, discredit. This wasn't just unethical. It was a roadmap for corruption, and the chilling abuse of judicial influence for political survival. I met with my legal team that evening. Their faces were pale. This wasn't just a scandal now, it was constitutional crisis territory. You realize this could bring down more than one justice, my attorney warned. You may be staring at the beginning of an impeachment-level event. I didn't flinch. Then let it begin. We released the memo at sunrise. Within hours, the Chief Justice's office issued a formal response, his first public statement since the original confrontation. It read, in part, certain recent allegations are deeply misleading and politically motivated. The court has always conducted its affairs with integrity. We urge the public not to be swayed by sensationalism. But no one was buying it anymore. Every network ran the headline, Crockett releases explosive memo, Supreme Court integrity in question, the walls were closing in. And that's when I got the message I never expected. A handwritten note. Slipped under my locked office door. For words, he's ready to resign. I stared at the note in my hand, my heart thudding slow and heavy. He's ready to resign. No signature. No handwriting I recognized. But the timing, the delivery, it all pointed to one thing, someone close to Roberts had flipped. My instincts told me not to celebrate. Not yet. Because power that old, doesn't surrender quietly. I held a private meeting with the bipartisan inquiry team. Everyone sat in silence as I slid the note across the table. For a moment, no one moved. Then Representative Raskin leaned back and exhaled. If this is real, he said, we're standing at the edge of a moment that will be in textbooks for the next 100 years. But we had to be sure. Resignation wasn't enough. The rot ran deeper than one man. So we pressed forward. That same day, our inquiry subpoenaed communications from Roberts' judicial assistant, and uncovered a second memo dated only 6 weeks prior. It outlined an internal effort to shield one justice from financial disclosure during an ethics review and suggested they use a sacrificial narrative to preserve the court's credibility. That narrative? Roberts stepping down voluntarily. They were trying to preserve the institution by feeding it its own figurehead. And still, no one took responsibility. I stood before the House chamber and delivered the most important floor speech of my career. This isn't about politics. This is about trust. And when the highest court in the land operates like a secret society, shielding, threatening, manipulating, the people have every right to demand more. I will not stop until the full truth is in public view. Even if that truth rattles marble pillars. The chamber gave me a standing ovation. Even a few members who had once dismissed me as too bold rose to their feet. And then, as if history itself had been listening, at 6:04 p.m., the news broke, breaking, Chief Justice John Roberts to address the nation in live statement tomorrow. For the first time in modern American history, the Chief Justice was going live, not to rule, not to lecture, but to explain. The world held its breath. And I knew. Whatever happened next would change the country forever. The Capitol was silent. Not in noise, in breath. In tension. In the gravity that comes before history tilts. At exactly 8 p.m., the feed went live. Every major network. Every live stream. Every political podcast. America was tuned in, and so was the world. Chief Justice John Roberts appeared on screen. No robe. No gavel. Just a plain desk, the Supreme Court seal behind him, and a face that had aged 10 years in the past 10 days. He began, "Good evening. I speak not as a jurist, but as a citizen who has served this country for over 4 decades. I have always believed in the strength of our institutions, in their ability to withstand scrutiny, even dissent. But recent events have made it clear that the public's confidence in this court has been shaken, and not without cause." My phone buzzed non-stop as texts poured in. I barely looked. I was focused on him, the man who once told me, on national record, that if I didn't like the country, I should leave it. Now he was the one being forced to let go. He continued, "While many of the allegations leveled recently are deeply contested, I cannot allow the legitimacy of this court to become collateral damage in a broader war of narratives. And so, effective immediately, I am resigning as Chief Justice of the United States." A single beat of silence. Then the press exploded. Newsrooms shouted over themselves. Legal scholars lost their composure on air. Millions took to social media in disbelief. Hashtags trended instantly, hashtag Roberts resigns, hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag reclaim the court. But inside my office, I sat still. Not satisfied. Not triumphant. Resolved. Because this wasn't the end. Roberts was the beginning. The network was still intact. The strategies, the rot, the hidden strings, all still in place unless we kept pulling. And I was ready to keep pulling. The very next morning, I filed a formal motion with the Judiciary Committee, an investigation into systemic misconduct and ethical violations at the highest levels of the United States Supreme Court. Because the truth isn't a destination. It's a battle. And I had just won round 1. Chief Justice Roberts' resignation sent shockwaves across every branch of government, but for me, it was never just about one man. It was about the machine behind the robe. The one that tried to silence me, discredit me, and intimidate me into compliance. They failed. Within a week of his departure, 2 more justices were forced to recuse themselves from ongoing cases amid mounting evidence of concealed financial entanglements. One quietly announced retirement. The other lawyered up. The Judiciary Committee, with bipartisan backing, approved the formation of an independent judicial oversight commission, the first of its kind. Its mandate: to investigate patterns of corruption, enforce ethical compliance, and ensure no Supreme Court justice ever operated without accountability again. People asked me if I felt vindicated. The truth? I felt responsible. For the clerks who came forward. For the aides who handed over documents in secret. For the staffers who whispered truth behind closed doors, terrified of retaliation. I didn't bring this system down alone. I just refused to look away. One afternoon, I returned to the very room where Roberts had once told me to leave this country. I stood at the witness table again, now flanked by supporters, press, and fellow lawmakers. And this time, no one dared speak over me. I said, "You can't threaten a nation into silence. You can't preserve justice by hiding the truth. And if the courts are to serve the people, they must be answerable to the people." Applause followed. But more than that, reform followed. Mandatory financial disclosures. Term transparency. Third-party review of judicial ethics. Real tools. Real change. And me? I kept going. Because the work of democracy isn't glamorous. It's messy. Dangerous. Unrelenting. But it's also worth it. So the next time someone says a lone voice can't shake the system, tell them what happened when a congresswoman refused to sit quietly, even when the highest judge in the land told her to disappear. Tell them about the day power blinked first. And tell them, we never stopped pushing.